I'm here to talk about a device for getting a better look at what lies underneath the surface. Maybe it's a good metaphor or an emblem for conferences like this, or maybe it just is what it is. Fluid-preserved specimens are an important part of natural history collections and exhibitions. Glass containers are preferred for both collection storage and display because of their clarity, and because glass containers, unlike clear plastic ones, are not dissolved by common preservative fluids like alcohol. It's a good thing this jar is made of glass. The acrylic block propping up the fish inside of it dissolved, but that's another story. Most common types of jar found in museum collections, those with opaque screw-top lids or with ground glass stoppers, don't afford good views through their tops, limiting viewing angles for exhibition. Table cases, in which most objects are seen from above, are a particularly challenging exhibition situation for fluid-preserved specimens. Flat plate glass can be used to make a translucent lid that affords the possibility of a top view into the container. However, condensation, drips, and ripples in the fluid surface will often spoil the view from above. From the side, those same drips and ripples can create confusing shadows and bright spots on a specimen that is otherwise clearly visible. The speckles on this shark are created by light shining through the drips on the underside of the lid. Here is the same specimen under even illumination. Immersion of the interior surface of the container solves the problems of condensation and ripples interfering with light transmission, just like a snow globe. But lid immersion interferes with jar sealing, and it eliminates important headspace for thermal expansion or contraction. The view top lid, developed at the California Academy of Sciences for the presentation of fluid-preserved specimens in the 2019 exhibition Skin, Living Armor, Evolving Identity, solves these problems by incorporating glass construction, an air gap, and lid immersion. Custom fabrication by a glass artisan is necessary, but for the modestly sized containers depicted here, the work is relatively inexpensive and within the basic capability of a scientific glass shop. The bottom of the view top lid, shown facing up here, has a shoulder or rabbet. The top of the lid is flat. The system consists of a base jar and the lid. This particular lid was made to fit a base jar that we already had on hand. Here, the lid and base are assembled. This cross-section diagram shows the basic construction details of the view top lid system. The rabbet or shoulder in the lid creates headspace large enough to allow the bottom face of the lid to contact the liquid preservative while preventing seal fluid contact. Fluid contact with the bottom of the lid prevents drips and ripples from interfering with the view. A fill hole allows fluid to be added after the lid is sealed. The void space in the lid allows it to be welded from commercially available borosilicate tube and plate. A vacuum relief hole is a fabrication artifact. It prevents dangerous negative pressure from developing in the void space after it's welded. It can be filled with silicone as soon as you get your work home from the shop, before any dust can get in and spoil the view. My communications with the glass shop are shown here. The shop was happy to work from hand-drawn sketches, email descriptions, and conversations on the phone, which were important. I originally proposed a solid glass lid, its shoulder or rabbet to be machined from a thick plate of glass. We talked about it on the phone, and the fabricator countered with the hollow design presented in the previous slides, which was far less costly to make. Borosilicate vessels are typically worked on lathes, so the capacity of the lathe in your fabricator's shop will also be an important factor in what size containers you can commission. This video shows a disc being fused to a tube to make a jar bottom. Here is a diagram of the components of a view-top container system. These parts will be welded together to make a base jar and the lid. When developing dimensions for a container, it's a good idea to take a look at the tubing sizes offered by borosilicate glass manufacturers and talk to your fabricator about what sizes of tubes and discs they stock. The filling procedure begins when the specimen is mounted and placed in the container. Enough preservative fluid is added to the container to keep the specimen covered. Silicone is then applied to the clean rim of the jar, but the filling hole is left open. When the rim seal cures, the fluid level is topped off through the filling hole to bring it up past the bottom of the lid, but not far enough to choke the headspace or contact the seal. I'm using a large syringe and a needle with a blunt tip. These images show a meniscus forming where the fluid has started to contact the bottom of the lid. Once that disappears, filling is finished. The fill hole is then sealed and allowed to cure. Now the container can be installed. Unfortunately, silicone is vapor permeable. Some alcohol and water will pass through it. The preservative fluid has lost contact with the bottom of the lid in this picture. It needs topping up in order to prevent the meniscus from wandering and interrupting the view of the fish below. The jar can be topped off by adding preservative with a syringe and a sharp needle pushed through the silicone-sealed filling hole. Here is a close-up. You may have already noticed that this particular lid doesn't look like the glass example I showed earlier. I made it from acrylic in our wood shop. The glass shop we worked with declined to fabricate a rectangular version of the design I presented here. Most glass shops will only weld containers that can be put on a lathe. It is very hard to find a glass shop that will weld rectangular containers, like the jar base in this picture. And if you can find one, the work will be very expensive. In case you are concerned about this lid dissolving, I'm glad to let you know that the boxfish was transferred back to its all-glass storage container after the 6-month run of this show. I'd like to end this talk with some suggestions for further experimentation should any of you decide to try this at home. Since preservative was lost through the seals of these jars, I'd like to suggest some possible strategies for lessening that leakage. The first is to improve jar-to-lid contact by grinding the mating surfaces flat. This could facilitate a much thinner seal, which would lessen the vapor transmissible area of it. The second strategy would be to investigate alternate sealing compounds that may have a lower vapor transmission rate. Different silicone resin chemistries and additives can be explored. Non-silicone compounds could also be tried out. This figure from NewSil, the maker of silicone resins, compares water vapor transmission rates of 9 different silicone chemistries. Thanks for your attention. If you have questions and comments, I would love to hear from you in the Q&A or via email. I'd like to acknowledge everyone who helped prepare this presentation and to thank the organizers of the Mount Makers Forum again for the opportunity to discuss this topic with you all. I'm wishing you clearer views from above in the future.
Well, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you, Ian. I've always been terrified of those jars, and that was really, really helpful. Our Q&A facilitator is Lisa Imamura. So Lisa, do you have some questions?
Yes, all right. Ian, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
All right, great. So we do have a question in the Q&A. Keep them coming, folks. The question is, how often do you find yourself having to top off the fluid on exhibition? And do you have to reseal the fill hole each time?
Yeah, for this exhibition, we just did one top off, and I think it was about after maybe it was a roughly 6-month exhibition, and I can't recall exactly how long through it was, but I think it was at least 3 months. And actually, that particular jar may have had some other sealing problems that contributed to the loss of fluid. So, and it also, because that was a plastic lid, it may have even absorbed some of the fluid preservative into the plastic. Not sure about that. I didn't weigh the lid before putting it on, so I couldn't tell. But the fill hole doesn't have to be resealed because it's just being pierced by this very thin needle. And so it just, we assume it, it's good enough, even though there's, I guess, some kind of passageway through there, it's tight enough that it doesn't need to be resealed. But with a thin needle, it does take a while to get, even a few cubic centimeters of fluid in there.
All right. Actually, as kind of a follow-up question, if you were worried about it absorbing some of the fluids, does that mean it's not a reusable lid? Is that correct?
Well, yeah, the plastics are they can be problematic because most preservative fluids, especially the alcohols, will dissolve the plastic, and it's just not as stable as the glass. So that's why we were trying to make these glass versions. In the case of the square lid, we just couldn't do that economically, so we went with the plastic. I think one of the themes from this show, or from this conference, that I've noticed is how, sometimes mounts that you make for an exhibition have a life that goes beyond the run of the show. And in natural history museums, I think that's often the case. And so I think it's, I always try to make things that will last longer than just the run of the show, because often the show stays up longer than anticipated, or it gets used for storage. So there's a danger in kind of just making things that are temporary.
Absolutely. So we have another question here. I wonder if casting a glass lid in a mold instead of welding would be an option for the rectangular forms.
Yeah, I'm not a glass worker myself, so yeah, I guess there's probably many different ways of fabricating things out of glass, and yeah, that could work. I know, the thicker the glass is, I believe the more you'll get kind of a distortion of, when the light, when it goes into a denser surface, it'll bend and then come back out, and you get this displaced image, which can sometimes be disorienting. So that could be an advantage of having these kind of thin, hollow layers in that top lid, but that would be definitely something to try. If you could make those surfaces very smooth and flat, I think the plate glass that a glass fabricator uses is very, very flat. It's float glass, so it has nice optical qualities.
Sounds great. We did have a question come in about the specifics of the silicone used. Do you happen to have that on hand?
No, I don't. I think in this case, it was just a General Electric type. It was either type 1 or 2. I think, yeah, I always get mixed up in that and have to refer to it. I've used other kinds of silicone, and certainly you could you could mix up your own and stuff that in a tube and use it to, yeah, one of the types gives off acetic acid as it cures, I believe, and the other, I don't know what it does. So that's something to think about. Anyway.
For sure. So there is a question here. Did you talk to any aquarium makers when seeking the rectangular jar?
Yeah, most aquaria are glued together, and it's problematic with alcohol. Alcohol will dissolve. It'll dissolve things. I actually had a project where we made some square glass containers with an adhesive that the fabricator said, "Oh yeah, this is you know, alcohol safe," and they gave me some data that said, you know, there was no decrease in bond strength. I think it was a cyanoacrylate, like a UV cure cyanoacrylate adhesive, and about a week after I'd put the specimens in the jars, the adhesive softened and came in the next morning, and the jars were, you know, half full of alcohol, and the rest had run out. They hadn't been installed yet, so they'd run out into a secondary containment. But it was that's when we went with the welded glass.
Fair enough. I'm glad that you found that out before it was installed, because that could have been a mess, right?
Yeah, it was bad enough as it was.
Oh my gosh, so this is Emily again. That was fantastic, Ian. Thank you so much. Great questions.